Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Robert Aucoin, and I'm an educational consultant, teacher, and occasional podcaster with an interest in pretty much everything. But I'm particularly interested in history and my own history, which is the history of the Acadians, primarily from the maritime provinces of Canada. Before I get into this in any depth, though, I really want to take a few minutes at the beginning and give a warm thank you to Shaw Communications and Shaw Spotlight for all their support on this panel discussion. They've been extremely helpful from a technical and a content point of view, so I really appreciate their help. Today, I've brought together an eclectic panel of experts to help me tell a story about a people, and in fact, an entire society who many years ago, centuries ago, were abruptly ripped from their homes over the course of several years. Their homes and their lands and everything they'd worked for generations were destroyed. These people were violently put onto ships and banished to various locations of what is now primarily the United States and England. Some of the families were separated. They never found each other again. Children sometimes were separated from parents. Husbands were sometimes separated from wives, brothers separated from sisters. Disease, drownings killed upwards to 50% of these people. Some managed to escape into the forests and later died due to exposure. Others were later recaptured and forced to work as labor on the land that they had previously owned. At this point, you might be forgiven if you're thinking of other, perhaps better known stories like the African slave trade. And unfortunately, the pattern is uncomfortably similar. But in fact, I'm not talking about the African slave trade. I'm talking about the French Acadians who were expulsed or deported from what was then known as Acadia and is now known as Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and PEI. So today I'm joined by a group of experts on Acadian history, and they're going to tell us facts around the deportation, as well as their own personal and poignant stories about the deportation, since everyone on this panel, including myself, is Acadian, and we all have various links to the deportation. But what I'd like to do first is introduce the members of our panel and then allow everyone to tell their personal stories. So I'll begin with Susan. Susan Surratt Draper is originally from southwest Nova Scotia and now resides in the ancient Acadian village of Rivière-au-Canal. And for many years, she was a guide and interpreter at Grand Pré National Historic Site of Canada, which is really the preeminent source for all things Acadian in Canada and arguably around the world. Next on our panel is Martin, goes by Marty Guidry, who's a retired chemist, but really an Acadian genealogist and historian from Louisiana. Marty has published numerous articles on Canadian history, genealogy. He's presented seminars on the subject, and he's conducted many genealogical workshops. Warren Pavin, next on our list, is a lawyer, also from Louisiana, who's done extensive work reviving interest in Acadian history and culture. And he's famous, I would say, I don't think there'd be any argument, he's famous within the Acadian community for leading a campaign to compel Queen Elizabeth II of England to acknowledge and apologize for the Acadians' expulsions from Nova Scotia. And last but not least, Georges Arsenault is a Canadian historian and folklorist from Prince Edward Island. George, too, has published widely about Acadian culture, traditions, and history. Now, I finish with Georges because I want to start with Georges by getting some of the basic facts about the expulsion. When you read about the expulsion, we always say it happened in 1755, but when you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that it actually started quite a bit before that. And so I'm hoping Georges can kind of bring us up to speed on some of those things. And as with most histories, the real story is far more complex than the basic facts which suggest. And so I think it's worth kind of digging into the events that led up to the expulsion. So for example, what was happening in Acadia, which is now the Canadian Maritime Provinces. Georges, could you start us off on that?
Well, that's a big job you're giving me. I'm not a specialist on the deportation, but I can give you a few facts. Well, first of all, for those maybe who are not familiar with Acadie or Acadia, it became a French colony starting in the very early 1600s. And most of the settlers, or the first settlers, really came in the 1630s. And the colony of Acadie, which was French, was located between two important colonies: New England, that belonged to Great Britain, and then New France, say Quebec, to the north, which was a French colony. But during over 100 years, there was this friction, there was this almost, what would I would call it, trying to find who would own or control all of North America. So quite often, Acadia was attacked by British troops from the 13 colonies. In fact, it was attacked a number of times, and for some years, Acadie was under the British rule. Then it turned back to France, back and forth a number of times. But in 1710, the capital of Acadie, which was Port-Royal, Port Royal, was attacked by the British. And in 1713, a treaty was signed between France and England, and Acadie became officially, again, British territory, a British colony renamed Nova Scotia. So the Acadians were given the permission to remain on their land if they wanted to take an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. Well, that was natural in those days. When a new territory became a new colony, changed hands, the settlers had to take an oath of allegiance. The Acadians had a problem with that. They said, okay, we'll take one as long as we can keep our Catholic faith, because France was officially a Catholic country, England was Protestant. So that was one thing that they wanted. The other one, they said, well, if war breaks out again, we don't want to go to war. We want to be neutral, because they didn't want to go to war against their neighbors, other Frenchmen in North America. And the other one, they wanted the freedom to migrate if they wanted to. So there was those three things. And it took a while before finally one of the governors at Port Royal, which became Annapolis Royal, accepted orally that they could take such a oath of allegiance, but they wouldn't have to, they could keep their religion, etc. So that was okay, but their neutrality became questioned, especially in the 1740s, because there was a war between France and England between 1744 and 1748, and France tried to reconquer Acadie, Nova Scotia, and they came with troops, and they were expecting the Acadians to support them. But the Acadians, since they had promised the British that they would be neutral, most of them didn't help the troops that came over, but a few did, of course. And there was some battles, some British soldiers were killed, especially at Grand Pré. So that became a big question, because England was almost lost Acadie in the 1740s. So they said, we have to do something, because they hadn't brought any British settlers to Nova Scotia since they had become their property, their territories in 1713 officially. So they decided that they had to bring in Protestant settlers, that they had to build forts to better protect themselves. So, and the government of Nova Scotia moved from Annapolis Royal to Halifax, and they built an outpost there, and they built one also near Grand Pré and other places. So they had to make sure that they could defend themselves if the French were going to attack again. And also, they built one near what is Amherst today, where a lot of Acadians were settled in Beaubassin. And the French decided to build one on the opposite side of the Missaguash River, which is the boundary between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And they built a fort there called Fort Beauséjour, because according to the French, west of the Missaguash River was still French property territory, while on the south or the east, that was Nova Scotia. But the British were contested that. But anyway, later on, the British tried to attack again and take over Acadian, especially they went around Beaubassin in the late 1740s. And finally, the British said, well, we have to get them to take an oath of allegiance, the Acadians. And that was a big problem. The different Acadian communities sent petitions to the governor in Halifax, trying to explain that they were neutral. They had signed an oath of allegiance, but especially the new lieutenant governor that came to Halifax, Charles Lawrence, didn't accept that. He wanted the original oath of allegiance that would be sworn by the Acadians. Anyway, the Fort Beauséjour was attacked and conquered by the British in June of 1755. And they lost it. The French lost Beauséjour, and inside the fort, they found a few hundred Acadians who were part of the militia. So then they could say, Charles Lawrence and others, well, you said you would be neutral, but you're not. You know, and the Acadians responded, well, we didn't have much choice. We were told that if we didn't join the militia, we could be deported. They got that message from the governor of New France. So from then on, the government in Halifax decided there was no way out. They were going to deport the Acadians to the New England states. And it's from there that the deportation started. Maybe my friends here would like to add something to what I said, but those are some of the facts leading to the deportation.
Yeah, no, I think that's really excellent. I mean, the Acadians at the time, as I understand it, and I'm not a historian, but they were really in an impossible situation. I mean, one of the things that I also read recently was that one of the other reasons they didn't really want to sign an allegiance was because their neighbors and their friends were the Mi'kmaq people, and they were really concerned about what the implications were going to be there. And at the same time, and I don't want to get into too much detail because I know this is really controversial, but they had certain people, for example, Père Lalutte, who was from France, who was encouraging them to do exactly the opposite. So they were really caught, I think, in that way.
Yes, because the Acadians, they were farmers. They were people who were trying to raise big families, but the big decisions were not taken in the Acadian communities. It was by the French authorities at Louisbourg or in Quebec or France. Yeah. So they were kind of caught in this fight, and there was not much they could do except try to hold to their neutrality.
Yeah. Susan, I wonder, could you jump in here for as long as you'd like, but to sort of take up from where Georges left off?
Yes, perfect. I was dying to jump in because Georges took us exactly to where I'm ready to kind of take it from there, because we know that Fort Beauséjour kind of is the beginning. When Fort Beauséjour falls in June, from the 6th to the 16th, that happens way faster than the British. Well, the British and the New England militia were planning. Really, the French didn't have much of they weren't ready. And so the fort fell quite a bit faster. And so according to John Winslow, who left us his diary, by the way, which is an extremely powerful and useful tool to understand the Acadian deportation. John Winslow is there. He's from New England, and he's recruited people to come, and based on his own reputation, he's a fine fellow, you know, a descendant of the Mayflower first pilgrims, and I think a graduate of Harvard, that sort of thing. So he has recruited people, and now they're sitting around with nothing to do, and they're starting to get in trouble. So he's getting a little nervous, but then he gets a message from Charles Lawrence saying, well, since you're sitting around and not doing anything, why don't you go to Windsor, to Pisiquid, which is Windsor, for join Alexander Murray there and receive your instructions. So he takes all of his people and they go to Windsor at Fort Edward, and they receive the instructions that they should now go to Grand Pre. So they go to Grand Pre and they start setting up their camp there. So so that's in August. So that's not very long after the fall of Beauséjour. Now, meanwhile, people in Beauséjour the French have fallen, so they are repatriated. But the Acadians who are there are meant to be deported. So ships are sent to pick them up. Now, there's some hitches with picking them up at Beauséjour, but in the meantime, Colonel Winslow has made his way to Grand Pre with his troops, and he takes over the priest's house as his main central location, and he uses the church as a place for the arms, and he has pickets erected around to make their camp. Because in Grand Pre, unlike Fort Edward or Fort Beauséjour or Port Royal, was not a military post. There's no fort at Grand Pre. So it kind of makes sense that the biggest probably building they could use would have been the church, and no doubt was in the center of the community. So that's what they use. Now, while he's there, he still has quite a bit of, he and Alexander Murray, who was at Fort Edward, and he's also in an Acadian area. So we know that there are Acadians in the Port Royal area, the major first settlement. There are Acadians in Les Mines, which covers really Grand Pre and Pisiquid. And so they have like the major amount of Acadians. There are other Acadians scattered here and there. And of course, there are Acadians in the French territories of Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton, who did remain French. And so they're looking to kind of grab the biggest population as quickly and efficiently as possible. So what they come up with, they have a plan, and it comes from Colonel Lawrence in Halifax, who's sending them letters. And luckily for us, John Winslow decides to keep those letters in his diary, so very handy. And so, and in the meantime, of course, Charles Lawrence is communicating really with his mentor, Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, who really has a vested interest too to claim Acadia as a British territory. So what they come up with, a plan. And the plan is they will call in all the men old enough to bear arms and threaten them if they don't come to the meeting, they're going to confiscate their lands, ironically. Now, they plan to imprison them, but first they have to confiscate their arms and their boats. So, you know, there's going to less friction as possible. But the Acadians who live in a disputed territory, and they see these soldiers here, but it's not the first time that the British show up and ask them to do things. So they do, and they show up for the meeting that has been called on September 5th, where the men and boys old enough to hold arms are called to this meeting to hear the king's orders. And so they go, only the men and boys, because part of the plan was very strategic. If you can separate the men and boys from the women and children, then you can control the men and boys. Because really, what man or boy really will want to fight against a troop of soldiers, knowing that their wives, their brothers and sisters, their elderly parents are totally without protection? What is going to happen to them? So what an effective way to handle the whole population. And so that's the plan, and that's what happens. Now, sounds like a plan, but of course, there's hitches, because like most plans hastily drawn up, even though they'd been thought about for a long time, there are hitches. So the ships come late. They get there sporadically. Colonel Winslow, while at first he's pretty gung-ho on the whole idea, as time wears on and he has these people on his hands and he sees how desperate they are, he sees he has to keep his soldiers in line, which is not all that easy either. And the ships are just not coming. And so he's sending letters back and forth saying, where are these ships? What's going on? But eventually, even though at some point he gets a little worried that the boys and men, the young ones in particular in the church, are getting restless, and he does board them onto ships in the harbor, that's kind of just a way to separate them for the meantime. He doesn't just send them that way. He lets them reunite with their families before they are actually boarded. And that's one of the usual misconceptions, that they're separated. Well, people may be separated, and people were separated, but it wasn't really the big plan. The big plan was to get rid of everybody. And so while people are waiting around, of course, they want to start with, of course, the most dangerous, according to the British, would be the ones at Fort Beauséjour, the ones they had captured there, because they were, like Georges said, in French Acadie. They were most likely to be the French partisans. They were, according to the British, the most dangerous. And so they wanted to get those guys out of there fast. And they wanted to send them as far as possible. So their destination for the 7 ships that left from there was South Carolina and Georgia, as far down as possible. Now that's that. They waited a long time. They didn't leave really till October 13th into November. And that's because the women who were the women of the men who had been captured were discouraged, strongly discouraged, by pain of excommunication for all of their children, etc., that if they went to join their husbands, they would never, they were not, they were threatened. So all these ships have different ports where they're going to land. And then the people of Rivière-au-Canard, which often are kind of lumped in with the gang of Grand Pré, actually, most of the people of Rivière-au-Canard are sent to Virginia. And that's interesting. And that will have repercussions to that as the story carries on. And so there's, in Annapolis Royal, there's a particular situation going on, because the colonel, Handfield, who is in charge at Annapolis Royal, has married an Acadian woman, talking about conflicts of interest. And so he really, really drags his feet on this. You can tell by the letters in Winslow's journal. He's keeping those letters from Handfield, and Handfield saying, well, you guys don't need to come and get us right now. Why don't you get yourself sorted? And then finally, you can catch us later. So it turns out that the people, finally, he can't stall anymore. And the people in Annapolis do go board their ships in December. So now we're talking about winter crossings. And that the people of Annapolis are sent out till May, actually, of the following year. Now, they're the ones that are deported, end up in Massachusetts, North Carolina, Connecticut, Boston, New York, South Carolina. Now, Annapolis has a really interesting story because of all the deportations. This is the one where Acadians actually take over a ship, can commandeer it, and that's the Pembroke. So the whole story of the Pembroke is one that is a whole story in itself, where there's a small crew, 8 people. The Acadians aboard have the premier carpenter, ship's carpenter, Charles Beliveau, who just happens to be there, who is able to fix the ship when it gets into trouble, and then with the other Acadian men take over the ship. And so they escape deportation, which is a good thing, because there was about 225 people on that boat, 32 families, and they were supposed to go to North Carolina. They end up going up the river, the St. John River, and ultimately finding refuge either in New Brunswick or Quebec. But that's Annapolis. Now, we might think that Les Mines had been cleared out by then, but no, as we said, there weren't enough boats and not everybody could get on. So what happened to the people that were still left over from Les Mines was that they were told to go and stay in the houses of the people from Grand Pre who had been deported. So if you're talking about traumatic stress, that can't be easy. And so while they're in the village of Grand Pre waiting for their boats to happen, to come and pick them up, you have the people of the Village des Antoines and the Village Landry, and the people who didn't get on the boat from Rivière au Canard. And so ultimately, but not until December, the 13th and the 15th, so again, we're talking about winter crossings, you have these 98 families, which is around 600 people, are boarded onto ships and they're sent to Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia. Now, that's December 13th. On December the 20th, there's a group of Acadians, 50, from Mir-le-Guèche, which is the Lunenburg area, and they're sent from Halifax to North Carolina. So you might think when you talk about the deportation, oh, it's 1755 and that's it, that's all. No, that would be wrong because it goes on through the whole period. And so in 1756, well, remember all those Acadians who got sent to Virginia? Virginia would not have it. They said basically, who sent you here? The British? Good. We'll send you back to Britain. And so they did. And they sent them to the port towns of Portsmouth, Bristol, Falmouth, Liverpool, and Southampton. They're going to stay there in warehouse accommodations, basically surviving on handouts until the war is over, when they will get repatriated to France. But that's another story. And Marty's probably going to tell us more about that. We know that, remember, Louisbourg and Prince Edward Island were still French territories. So they weren't part of this first deportations and upheaval and all of that. Because we talk about deportations and we can say where the ships went. But really, we have to remember that they weren't getting everybody. So the numbers are off and not accurate and guessed, but there could be as much as a third of the Acadian population that escaped one way or another. They escaped, they didn't show up for the meeting, they were captured but did escape. There were many, many different scenarios. So they're not getting everybody. But then, of course, there's the French territories. So nothing happens to the Acadians there, except all of a sudden they get these refugees from who are escaping the English Acadie to French Acadie. And so to Louisbourg or to Ile Saint-Jean, they're getting people from there who are trying to escape. But now, after the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, then now all of the Acadians who are there will suffer deportation as well. And so they're sent to French ports, however. It's a different scenario at a different time. But again, directly to France. Yeah. Yes. So it's treacherous winter crossings. There are shipwrecks, disease, you name it. It's a harrowing story. But then, but that's not even the end of it. In 1759 to 1760, the latest ones to be caught, it seems, are the Acadians in Cap Sable, which is southwest Nova Scotia in the Pumco area. And they have evaded and avoided and hidden and all of that for all of this time. They were a smaller population. First of all, they didn't bother with them. But secondly, when they were finally at the end and they said, because in southwest Nova Scotia, they had always had really close relations with Boston, New England. They traded with them, etc. So they sent a letter to their friend, the governor, and said, hey, we're here. Can you come and help us out of this mess? But the governor in Boston says, well, thank you very much. He sends the letter to Charles Lawrence, who then sends his rangers to go pick these people up. So they were definitely betrayed again. And so they, when they're finally caught, are held as prisoners in George's Island and then sent to France, as Cherbourg usually. And so now time is dragging on, and you have finally the French are defeated at the Plains of Abraham. 1759, September 18th. Now, if you're one of the Acadians who are hiding out and who have been living, fighting resistance, keeping your family safe, whatever, then you know no help is coming to you at this point. Quebec has fallen, the French are defeated. And so around 1,000 Acadian resistance fighters and their families surrender at Fort Beauséjour. They would avoid starvation, basically, at this point, and no help was coming. Now there's a band that say, we're still going to fight. We're going to fight till the end. And there's a battle of Restigouche, which is really, really the last battle. It's 1760 July, and that is really, really, really the end. And so captured and surrendered Acadians are held as prisoners in Fort Edward, Fort Cumberland, George's Island. They're released finally, though, after the Treaty of Paris, 1763. And what are they going to do now? Some sail south with the Broussard family. Some stay to rebuild their lives in locations all over the Maritimes. Some Acadians settle in Quebec. The ones that are in France are still in France, and that's a whole story. How do they get here? Do they get here? Where do they stay? But basically, I find the story of the deportation and this story illustrates why we can call it le grand dérangement, the great upheaval, because deportations are only the part of the story, are only the kickoff to the story. The rest of the migrations and the eras and all of the time that they're trying to find a homeland takes 50, 60, 100 years before they're finally settled into where they end up being. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, it would be important, I guess, to remind people that no Acadians were deported by the British to Louisiana. That's
Yes.
what we were taught for a long time. The Acadians started going to Louisiana after the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And the first ones went in 1764, and I'm sure that Warren and David will tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, I wanted to jump to Martin in just a minute, but it is interesting. I mean, so, you know, growing up in Nova Scotia and doing my little, I guess, junior high school history course, the way it was taught then, which I know was a long time ago, is basically, you know, the expulsion was in 1755. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the expulsion was in 1755, and it lasted a few weeks, and that's the end of the unit. Move on, right? And that's kind of the way it was presented. I'm hoping they do a better job now, but I actually don't know. And it's interesting because, you know, I'm very privileged in that I get to travel and work and live in countries all over the world now. And when I talk about Cajuns, everyone knows what I'm talking about. It's amazing. You know, I've been in like African countries and they've heard of Cajuns. They know what I'm talking about, but they do not know what Acadians are. They have no idea. They've never heard of it. Even within Canada, you go to Manitoba and Saskatchewan, sometimes they've never heard of the expulsion of the Acadians. So I think that Cajun connection is really important, and it's a part that I'm just learning about now. But anyway, I want to push this over to Marty, if that's okay. Marty, could you talk a little bit about, I don't even know how to word it, but the connection of how the Acadians become the Cajuns? I'll let you word it however you want. Could you take up the story there?
All right. I'll say a couple of things about the deportation as we go along. I think if you remember, the Nova Scotia itself was British. So the Acadians in Nova Scotia were British citizens since 1710, whereas the Acadians that were on Ile Saint Jean and Ile Royale and New Brunswick were French citizens at that time. And the general consensus at that time was that if you were going to exile someone, you had to exile them to your own country. So the Acadians in Nova Scotia were exiled to the British colonies, 9 of them, and Susan mentioned those 9. New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. But when they came and took over Fort Louisburg again, or Fortress Louisburg, that was French territory. And so when they captured what's now Prince Edward Island and the Acadians on there and brought them to Louisburg, all of those were French citizens, so they exiled those to France, and that was in 1758 and 59. So that's why we got those two different parts of the Atlantic involved. And as she mentioned, we really never exiled anyone to England. They were exiled to Virginia. There was a fight between the governor of Virginia, who wanted to let them stay in Virginia, and his advisors, who wanted to deport them. And they won, and they were put on ships and sent to England, as she mentioned. So that's how they ended up in England. None of them went to the Caribbean, except for one, and that was owned voluntarily. I'm not one Acadian, one boatload or a couple boatloads. That was in 1764 when Broussard de Beausoleil brought his group to Saint-Domingue with the idea of picking up some of his relatives there and bringing them up the Mississippi to the Illinois country to found a new Acadia. When he got to Saint-Domingue, he realized there was a big disease problem there and he didn't want to infect the whole ships. So they changed ships and left the people on Saint-Domingue and went directly to New Orleans, where they were convinced to stay in Louisiana and settle the Attakapaw country, which is today St. Martin Parish. So that's why we ended up with some Acadians there. The first group of Acadians to actually come to Louisiana, actually the first Acadian to come was in 1740s, and that was Joseph de Goutin, who was a soldier or somehow connected with Louisburg, but he had married a Thibodeau from Grand Pré. And he ended up coming down to Louisiana, I guess after the first fall of Louisburg, when it was taken over by the British. And he lived in New Orleans. And there's some thought that he was instrumental in bringing Acadians into Louisiana. The first group to come was a group out of New York who ended up sailing down to near Savannah and then going to Mobile and coming to New Orleans. Out of that group, several of the people were directly related to Joseph de Goutin. And so that's why they believe he may have kind of been the instrument pulling them down to that area. Those groups, there was only 4 families, and they settled in St. James Parish along the Mississippi River. And we have to remember that Louisiana, the Acadians thought it was French, when in fact not, it was Spanish. In 1762, in a secret treaty, right at the end of the French and Indian War, France gave Spain Louisiana, the Treaty of Fontainebleau. And so Spain owned it, but Spain didn't take it over for 4 years until 1766. They didn't send anyone, any governor or anything until 1766. So from 62 to early 66, it was managed by France. I'm mentioning this because the French and the Spanish had different ideas how to settle the people. In France's view, when the Acadians started arriving, they would ask them, where do you want to go? And they would let them settle there. When Spain had it, they decided it was different. They had all these British Americans. They weren't really Americans yet, I guess, but they were British that were coming west, and they wanted to put a stop at the Mississippi River. So they had Spanish forts opposite the British forts on the Mississippi River. The Acadians were then sent to those forts in order to form a militia to help the Spanish soldiers. And so I'll mention a little bit about that as we go on. So the first group was in 1764. The second group to come, that was an organized group that we know about, was Beausoleil, Broussard de Beausoleil, who showed up. And I mentioned that they ended up in the Attakapaw. Right behind them was another, they had about 200 people. Right behind them was another small group of about 40 or 50 people that went to St. Landry Parish today, which is Opelousas, and settled that area. So the Attakapaw-Opelousas region was settled in 1765 by the Acadians. Then we had a large group from Maryland. We had actually 4 convoys come from Maryland. And some of those that came from Maryland were in Pennsylvania, and they funneled into Maryland and left from Maryland to come to Louisiana. In 1766, they had a group, and it was still French. French was still in control at that time, so they let them settle where they wanted, and they settled on the St. James River, close to where the 54 group settled. And the way, which you show up in New Orleans, got to the mouth of the Mississippi River, was believed. These would let the governor in New Orleans know a ship of Acadians was there, and they would then get to New Orleans. There was a little town across the river, or King's, not really a town today, it's a town of Algiers. Back then it wasn't, but they had a hospital there. The Acadians were settled there for about a month, let them rest. Any of them that was sick could recuperate. During that month, they would take 4 or 5 men, deputies, and bring them and let them decide where they wanted to settle. They would come back, tell their people, and they'd agree, and they'd all go settle there after about a month.
So Marty, could I just interrupt for a second? Those people that you're talking about, I think you said it was 1764, who came in from Maryland, who had been other places. Those people had never been deported to European countries then, had they?
No, they had not.
Okay.
They had gone from Nova Scotia down to either Pennsylvania or Maryland.
Gotcha.
There was no group that came directly from Pennsylvania to Louisiana. They all came from Pennsylvania into Maryland and then got deported. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about my ancestor a little bit later on. So, and that 1764 group wasn't through Maryland, it came from New York, a small group from New York. I think they originally had been in Georgia. They had escaped Georgia because the governor, by the way, Georgia, you know, they had a law that did not allow Catholics in Georgia.
Oh.
And so they were not allowed initially to be in Georgia. And what Lawrence did was send a letter to each of the governors of the American colony that were coming and telling the governor to, here's what we got. They didn't know any, the only 2 governors that knew what was happening was Connecticut and Massachusetts. And that's because of Shirley.
Yeah.
But the other governors didn't know what was happening. In fact, the other governors weren't even there. They were in New York planning the French and Indian War. And so their deputies were left there with these Acadians arriving, not knowing what to do. So eventually the deputy in Georgia decided for humane reasons, he had to let them land. But when the governor got there, he said, y'all can leave. And he gave them some rickety boats and they started following the coast up. A few of them got into New York. Some of them picked up people in South Carolina with them. About 100 of them ended up in Massachusetts and Cape Cod area, and they were captured and held in Massachusetts because Lawrence didn't want them back in Nova Scotia.
Right.
So anyway, 1766, they had a group that wanted to leave from Maryland, a couple hundred. They came to Louisiana and they were settled along the Mississippi River in St. James Parish with their cousins in that had come in 1764. In 1767, there was another group that wanted to leave, and they left and came to Louisiana. But when they got there, it was now Spanish governor there, Governor Ulloa. Governor Ulloa decided they didn't have a choice where they were going to go. They had to go to what's now called St. Gabriel, Louisiana, in Iberville Parish, still on the Mississippi, but a few miles up the river from the people where they wanted to settle with. And they did not want to do that, but they were forced to, and they became a militia for the Spanish at St. Gabriel. And as an aside, there were 2 things they did that are really significant today to Louisianans. One is they built a church, and the church was completed in 1776, and it still stands today. And people can come and visit it and all. It was built by the Acadians. They had a carpenter that built it, but the Acadians helped and the Acadians financed it. Second thing they did, Susan knows this, the records from Grand Pre were confiscated by the Acadians. They really weren't confiscated because in the Catholic Church, you own your records. Mm-hmm. The church doesn't own the records, the people own the records. So they took their records, they brought them to Maryland. They were probably the group from Baltimore that did it. That's the group that came in 1767. They did not let anyone know about those records in Maryland. They were afraid they would be taken from them. They brought them to Louisiana. They held them secretly in Louisiana for a number of years till 1776. And then when the church was built, they gave them to the pastor, who then put them in a grass sack and threw them on the floor. They stayed that way until the 1950s. Wow. And somehow survived. And when the Baton Rouge Diocese was established in the 1950s, the bishop began an archives, and those records became part of the archives today. Only 3 volumes survive. There were probably 5 to 6 volumes, at least 5 volumes originally. We don't have the first volume. We don't have the very last volume, but we have the 3 middle volumes, which are very valuable to Acadians today who are doing genealogy and stuff. Yeah. So that was a 1767 group, and they They probably participated in the American Revolution because when Galvez brought his troops up, he spent the night in St. Gabriel before he attacked the British fort right on the other side of Bayou Manchac.
Mhm.
So they actually didn't do fighting, but they were there during the American Revolution. The third group that came was in 1768, and that was where my ancestor was in, left from Port Tobacco, Maryland in December of 1767, arrived in February of 1768, and they started a revolution against the governor, basically. They were told they had to go to what's called Fort St. Louis de Natchez. The key word there is Natchez. That was 260 miles north of New Orleans. They resisted very heavily, to the point where finally the governor Yoyoa said they were going to send you back to Maryland, get on the ships. And they decided to go. They didn't want to go for several reasons. One is Fort Rosalie was right across the river, the Mississippi River, from Fort St. Louis de Natchez, which is today near Vidalia, Louisiana, in Concordia Parish. So they did not want to go for that reason. Number two, there were some pretty hostile Indians in the territory. In fact, if you do Louisiana history, you realize in 1729, they massacred essentially everyone in Fort Rosalie. That was in 1729. This is 1768. Isn't that many years, only 40 years from that time frame. Third, when they sent their deputies up there to look at the land and all, it wasn't very fertile. It was full of swamps, heavily invested with mosquitoes, a lot of animals and things of that nature, and things they didn't know anything about. So they were kind of scared, and rightly so, as we'll see. But they went. And within about 18 months, half the population was dead from diseases and stuff. I have a letter from written by the commander of the fort there about Pierre Guidry's wife that says that she's covered with sores and won't survive, and she didn't survive. So it was pretty horrific the way they were dying. The fourth group was a more interesting group, only about 30 Acadians, along with some Germans, and that left Maryland. And they were on a boat, but the captain of the boat was an alcoholic and pretty belligerent guy. And when he got down about the beginning of the Mississippi River, he decided not to turn in. The Acadians noted that there's a lighthouse at Belize, and he turned the boat the other way and headed out into the Gulf. They threatened to take over the ship. So the second in command at night took the ship and started heading back towards shore. In the morning, the captain headed back out. Went on for a couple of days like that. Finally, they landed on Matagorda Bay in Texas. They were captured by the Spanish. They were held for about 6 months in a Spanish fort inland from Matagorda Bay, or not a fort, but a mission there, Spanish mission. They were then allowed to go to Natchitoches, Louisiana. They did not want the Acadians to leave Natchitoches, but the Acadians fought with the, not physically, but fought that issue, and eventually did go down to Ascension Parish, and then eventually did go into the Opelousas territory. So that group of 30 Acadians eventually did end up in South Louisiana. And that pretty much ended the immediate colony settling of Louisiana. Then there was a period of a number of years, and then all of a sudden in 1785, the Acadians that had been sent to France and those that had been sent to England and repatriated back to France, a number of those, about 1,600, which is a little over half, were volunteered to come to Louisiana. And when they got there, the Spanish decided you can settle wherever you want. And so they settled in various areas of Louisiana, from Baton Rouge all the way down through Ascension Parish area, and then eventually moved down Bayou Lafourche into Houma and Lafourche parishes on that. So, and then there was only one small group after that from St. Pierre and Miquelon. About 20 Acadians came in 1788 and came to Louisiana. And that pretty much ended all of the migrations into the Louisiana area. Warren may know more than me, I don't know about that, but we ended up with about 3,000 Acadians come to Louisiana, about half of them in the 1760s and half of them in the 1780s. I will say one thing about the English Acadians that ended up going to the northern part of France in 1763, a number of those were resettled on a little island off Brittany, France called Belle-Île-en-Mer, and established a colony there. It was a very difficult colony. The locals did not want them at first, and it was difficult to form there, but they persisted. Some of them left, but a number of them stayed, and there's still an Acadian community there if you go, and they're very proud of their Acadian heritage there.
Yeah.
So if you go to France, make sure you visit Belle-Île-en-Mer. It's one of the few areas that they're very still proud of their Acadian heritage. So,
Yeah.
so that's kind of how it happened in Louisiana.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. One of the reasons why I'm interested in this, obviously, being an Acadian, I'm interested in that and so on. But my real interest in it started when I left Nova Scotia and started traveling around the world. Because as you all know, any Acadian worth his or her salt can tell you his or her father and father's father and father's father. And I would go and travel around, and no one else could do that. And when I would do that, they would look at me like I had three heads. Like, really, you can do that? Like, that's crazy. And so that's when I started to realize how special this whole thing is, and the stories that you guys are telling. And yeah, it's history and it's old and so on, but it's really the modern view of those things, which is actually what kind of partially where I wanted to bring Warren in, and also to leave off where Marty ended. And I don't think I'm overselling this, and I don't want to undersell it either. But I think I speak for everyone when I say I think we really owe Warren in particular a very profound debt of gratitude for the work that he's done for all the Acadians around the world, and particularly in terms of history and culture. And then, of course, this petition to the Queen on our behalf. So, Warren, could I throw it to you? And I'll kind of leave it open. If you want to pick up where Marty left off, or if you want to talk about the petition to the Queen, I think people would be really interested in that too.
Thank you. A couple of additions to what the history has been related. I think it's interesting to focus on those Acadians who had escaped, about 3,000. And my ancestor, Joseph Broussard, who was called Beausoleil, sort of became the leader of that group. And he became known as a criminal in terms of the British viewpoint and a terrorist. And during the years that he was part of the insurgency, he was allied with the Mi'kmaq, and they used the war tactics that the Native Americans used. They didn't have cannons or ships. They had basically knives, spears, rifles. And they engaged in activities which were considered at the time terrorists. There's a book that was just released by Professor Tom Ricks. It's a biography of George Washington. And there, Professor Ricks notes that George Washington won the American Revolution by using the fighting techniques he had picked up fighting in the French and Indian War. It's pretty profound. And when that insurgency group led by Beausoleil surrendered, and they were placed on George's Island for a number of years, the British decided those militant Acadians would not be allowed to stay because they had engaged in terrorism. They knew they would resort to that again, foster another insurgency, basically rabble rousers that could not be trusted. It's interesting to compare what's going on at Guantanamo Bay, where America is dealing with a similar situation with Al-Qaeda. These were non-enemy combatants, never convicted of anything, yet we hold them in our prisons. And what we're doing is allowing them to go anywhere but their home country. And that's essentially what happened with Beausoleil's group. And they were the first to depart that island and come to Louisiana, as was discussed by Marty. The other question that was raised was, why are we called Cajuns and not Acadians in Louisiana? I graduated from the University of Louisiana here in Lafayette. Yes, Lafayette was named after the Marquis de Lafayette. And our mascot we are the raging Cajuns. We're still battling, and we're the Cajuns. But once they arrived in New Orleans, the large groups began arriving. They said, "Nous sommes des Acadiens." We are Acadians. And the locals, whether it was Spanish, whether they were Americans, whether British, couldn't pronounce or understand Acadien, and it was shortened to Cajun, and ultimately the English word Cajun developed from that. If anybody's been paying attention to the wonderful histories that have been related today, they should be outraged and do something about it, and that's what I was moved to do. As an attorney, I used my legal skills to first research for a couple of years, and then President Ronald Reagan issued an apology for the illegal internment during World War II of Japanese Americans. And that set off a light bulb in my head. I said, that's the exact thing that happened to my ancestors. We were British subjects illegally deported because under British law, the Petition of Right had granted British subjects the ultimate protection against deportation. The only way a person could be deported was by an act of parliament. So we know nobody ever mentioned due process or courts or anything. This was an illegal action undertaken in North America. No one ever mentioned the British Crown or the King of England because they had so little to do with it. It was a local act. Winslow was supported by the militia of New England. The Redcoats were not there. It was Longfellow in his fictional poem placed the Redcoats there, trying to shift the blame away from New England and more to London. All to say, I found in my research that I needed to bring an action against the British Crown, which still existed. And I needed to make sure that it was done in a timely manner. You might say, well, 250 years, Warren, is a little late. I found a petition that was published in a book by a Louisiana historian and politician, Senator Dudley J. LeBlanc of my hometown of Erath, Louisiana. And in the petition of the Acadians who had been sent to Philadelphia, 2 deputies delivered the document to the king in London and demanded certain things, one of which was an inquiry into how they had been illegally deported, an apology for the deportation, and a restoration of their good names, among others. So when I prepared a federal lawsuit, I attached their petition. I was actually demanding the British Crown answer the petition of the Philadelphia Acadians of 1760. I had it delivered by courier to the Prime Minister Thatcher and to Buckingham Palace. And I gave them 30 days to respond, or I was going to file a federal lawsuit. On the 28th day, I was contacted by the British Information Agency. I was told they had retained attorneys. They would be contacting me. That led to a law firm from Houston, Texas, and I negotiating for approximately 4 years. At one point, they offered me $1 million. And it's important to note, my petition didn't ask for a penny. It asked to the same thing that the Acadians had asked for previously. The $1 million was pledged as a endowed chair to study Acadian history at our university here in Lafayette. To show the seriousness of the offer, I challenged them, and they sent a history professor from Birmingham, England, who spent 5 days here checking us out, making sure we were legit and would do a good job with their $1 million. At the last minute, they tried to pull a fast one on me, and they wanted me to sign an oath of secrecy. They wanted to remain that they had never paid any money, which I laughed at them. I said, the whole purpose of the petition is to bring the world's attention to the wrong done in the name of the British Crown. I tried to sell it to them as though I am helping you redeem your good name. Because what was done in your name, when Winslow read the proclamation and the church at Grand Pré, he begins by, in the name of the king, all of your lands are forfeited. So that began getting the attention of the world press. I was invited to the World Francophone Human Rights Conference in Caen, France. And that got me on the world stage. And an article was printed after I was interviewed by a reporter with The Economist magazine, arguably one of the largest in the world and most important at the time. And he called for England to step up. It's time to acknowledge the wrongs of our historical past. That was a game changer for me. That got the Canadian government's attention. I had a chance to meet with Prime Minister Jean Chrétien at the World Francophone Summit in Hanoi in 1997. I was given a 15-minute conference with him. I sold him on the idea. He agreed to get the Canadian government behind it. And finally, in 2003, in December, the Royal Proclamation was signed by the Governor General, who was Adrian Clarkson at the time, in the name of the British Crown.
Now, did that proclamation, I know there was always back and forth about, what constitutes an apology. We were never, like you say, we were never asking for reparations. I'm not sure that would have made sense anyway, but in your view, did that proclamation constitute an apology?
From the get-go, it was decided the word would not be used. Governments don't use the word apology. They do it in other ways. And I had to agree with the Société Nationale de l'Acadie. We joined forces. When I started this, I was viewed as a crazy Cajun. What is this guy doing? It could have never come from Canada. It had to come from outside of Canada, because when I went to Canada for the first time, to New Brunswick in 1998, the tension was still in the air between French, Acadians, and the British. I couldn't believe it. In Louisiana, we never had that experience. So for us, we never experienced being put down here in Louisiana by the government. The government helped us. They gave us everything and more than the Acadians asked for to get us started. And in fact, Marty mentioned Beausoleil's group settled in Louisiana. Beausoleil was dead within a few months due to la picote, smallpox. But his son, Amon, died a very rich man. So the help that the government gave to the Cajuns allowed them to quickly get on their feet and prosper. So what the Royal Proclamation did, which had never been done before, the Crown admitted it was done in its name. Secondly, it acknowledged in the name of the Crown, people died and suffered. And thirdly, rather than an apology, we got something much better. There's an implied apology. There's an acknowledgement of wrongs. And a day of remembrance was created. And we picked the day. It's July 28th, the day the deportation order was signed in Halifax. We were given a day of commemoration, of remembrance, which we pause to remember, not celebrate, but acknowledge the suffering that our ancestors went through to transplant that culture to Louisiana.
Thank you so much for participating in the panel today. The story, as I mentioned at the top, the story of the Acadian people really isn't known that well outside of the Maritimes and Louisiana. And I think it's a really important story to be told, as we've discovered today. And I really want to thank you for sharing the facts around the deportation of the Acadians. Even though it's over 200 years old, I think it clearly has implications for us today. That is very clear. And what we're going to do in the next segment is we're going to take some of the facts that we talked about today and we're going to personalize them into our own personal stories. But let me just pause here and give a warm thank you to George and Susan and Marty and Warren. I know that you're very busy and I know you're very passionate about this subject, and so I really, really do appreciate your time. And thanks once again to Shaw Spotlight for helping us out on all of these panels that I've been privileged to do. So I look forward to seeing you again, and And thanks once again.